Welcome to Coffee and Contemplation, a Stranger Things rewatch podcast. I'm Robin.
I'm Heidi.
And today we'll be discussing Chapter 1, The Vanishing of Will Byers. So, we both are huge fans of Stranger Things, and we have been for a long time. We've had our ups and downs with all 3 seasons, but overall, we love this show, and I would even say that it's my favorite show as an adult, and so we just wanted to talk about it. So that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna discuss each episode in depth, but because it's a rewatch podcast that's being made now, after all 3 seasons have been made, we are going to be bringing that perspective to this. So this podcast is going to have all kinds of spoilers. So moving forward, that's the kind of podcast that this is. We're going to be kind of all over the place, bounce around a little bit, but we are really excited to talk about it. So let's get started. I want to give a few production shoutouts. In a lot of other podcasts, there's a lot of talk about certain members of the production team, but not as much about others. And so I want to do some shoutouts to some of the names that you don't hear as often, particularly the production designer, the casting director, the art director, and the editor. In particular, I want to give a shout out to the casting director for Stranger Things, Carmen Cuba, because of everybody in the production team, definitely had the biggest resume. And just to name a few of the big hitters from that resume are The Informant, Magic Mike, Now You See Me, Behind the Candelabra, The Martian, Logan Lucky. Hey! I knew we were going to do that. And Bad Times at the El Royale. That's a heck of a resume, and there's way more titles under her belt. So, like, I was really impressed, and it was like, well, that explains why.
The casting is so damn good.
Yeah, I mean, because seriously, the cast is one of the best things about this show. So, yeah, I think her work absolutely speaks for itself. So that was the big shout out I wanted to do specifically. But yeah, the production design, the art direction. You know, the cinema and the cinematography is beautiful. This season definitely has some of my favorite just standalone shots of all.
I was gonna say, so like, you know, talking about the difference between cinematography versus director of photography versus, you know, the art department. One of my favorite shots in this first episode is the first time that Dustin and Lucas and Mike see 11. So you have like their faces and their, you know, in their raincoats and it's pouring and they have like the only light in the whole scene is their flashlights. I mean, you know, we're led to believe.
Yeah.
And then you see like their terrified faces and then you see 11's terrified face and then there's just this, but it's like this moment of huge impactful meaning. And it's and like the way that those 2 shots are framed carries so much emotional weight.
So the cinematographer is gonna, you know, and again, I'm guessing because I haven't spoken to Tim Ives,
sure,
you know, so I don't, who is the director of photography for you know, for this episode at least, and for most of Stranger Things is my understanding. His other 2 big credentials include House of Cards and Girls. Those are the 2 big titles.
Those are big.
Mm-hmm. So, and also notably both series.
Mm-hmm.
That was something I noticed actually about quite a few of, not so much the casting director, but more the other, particularly the editor, Dean Zimmerman, and the art director, William G. Davis. All of them have a lot more television credentials, which I think, like, I just think that ends up lending itself really well to this series. It just says have a lot of experience in serialized storytelling, which is different from feature filmmaking. It really is. Not to say that one is better than the other, not even a little bit, but just that, you know, they are different.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, cinematography tends to be more framing, lighting, you know, where is the camera and how are you using the camera? And what's actually physically in the frame. And then production design, art department, and costume design are going to be the details of filling those things in. And usually they work closely with the director and DP so that then they kind of get a sense of what they want. And then, you know, in my experience working on different films, it's usually like we have a consultation with them early on. I'm an editor, so even though I don't have a lot of involvement with that part, it's good for me to hear, you know, if I can, what the creative vision is so that then I know how to cut a piece together. So yeah, wanted to just give a quick shout out to them because you don't tend to hear those names as often. And I think Stranger Things is a great example of how synergistically those departments can work together effectively, because I think all of them are firing on all cylinders here, because just the visual language and the visual style of this show is so good, particularly in this season.
Yeah, I think something that, like, one of the reasons people were so drawn to the show and were so, I'm going to say, charmed by the show. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily call the show overall charming, but like the 80s nostalgia, that is very charming. It's very, sort of entrancing. And one of the reasons for that is that, like, every single detail is so incredibly 80s. I mean, you can have things that are set in a certain time period, but that they don't try to make the time period a character. I would argue that, in Stranger Things, the time period and the town itself are both characters. Mm-hmm. And of course, those things intertwine, but they're also separate. Down to, like, something that I noticed today as we were watching the episode is when everyone from the town was out looking for Will, they all had those 80s flashlights that were in, like, they were either like red or blue, and they like put out absolutely no light whatsoever. But like just seeing that like circle of red, I was like, oh my God, I remember that. And even like, when Hop comes out and he's like standing on his deck and he's standing there smoking a cigarette before he starts getting ready for the day, even him standing out there looking at that lake somehow gives me 80s vibes. Even before he goes inside and starts like taking a shower in that, like, incredibly 80s bathroom, like even just that gives me 80s vibes. And I have occasionally wondered, like, how? Because it's a lake. But I think just like the way it's framed, and like I think the way the scene is framed reminds me a little bit of the way scenes would be framed in an 80s movie. Mm-hmm. And also something that you and I have talked about is in post-production, like the way that they use like I'm going to butcher this, so you're going to have to come along and help me. But like the way that they use like the colorization and everything that they do in post-production, and like, the Instagram filters that they use.
Color grading.
That's the one.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
They make it look as though it was filmed on film, and they give it like that 80s vibe. Which
is different from an editor that's a colorist.
Okay.
That does that. Either a colorist or a VFX artist is usually the one that does that. And I say that as an editor and not as a colorist or VFX artist. I do not actually do that yet. But yeah, and what I think is interesting is that, like, I agree, like I totally co-sign that. The other thing that I love about the production design and art direction of this show is that you get, especially in episode 1, you get so much narrative information from it. The characterization, you get the economic differences between the Wheelers and the Byers. You get the, even Hop, like, you have the lake. You get this sense that, like, he is isolated. Both he's removed from town. He doesn't have, like, he's out on this lake and it's beautiful, but I noticed this time around, like, he's by himself. He's very much alone in this big open space. Like, he's separate. But then also, then he's in this little tiny shower, and the feel of the school, and, like, that the kids are all in that space together. Mm-hmm. So it's just, yeah.
I mean, I had noticed before the economic tension between the Byers and the Wheelers, and what's interesting is looking at, the economic state of both Hopper and the Byers. They're really pretty similar. Mm-hmm. But if you look at, like, like the actual home environment, obviously the Byers are in a bit of a healthier place than what Hopper is at the moment. But they're in similar economic statuses, and I can't help but wonder if maybe that's part of the reason that Hopper really relates to the Byers a lot more than he does to the Wheelers pretty consistently throughout the show.
You don't tend to see him interact with the Wheelers very much,
apart from Mike.
Yeah, but like the actual, like, family, you don't. Yeah, they don't tend to share a lot of screen time, which is interesting. Like, there's a lot of things that I remember thinking, like, I wish that, like, these characters could have interacted more. But I definitely want to put a pin in the the nature of the family dynamics
Yes.
between the Byers, because that's definitely something I want to talk more about. So let's go ahead and get into it. So rather than, this is going to be a little bit different from other like rewatch podcasts in that we're not going to go through the plot chronologically, and already we're kind of jumping around. We're going to kind of go through them by thread, by like blocks of characters, because you know, it's been said, I first heard someone say it actually on the LSG Media Stranger Things podcast, The Hawkins Report. A listener wrote in there, but I've heard a bunch of other reviews also say that one of the things that makes this first season so effective, more than either of the other two, is that this first one really separates out the different groups and how they're all in different movies or stories. You've got the kids are kind of in their like Goonies, Stand By Me, kid adventure story. You've got the teen drama going on with Nancy, Steve, and Barb, but then you've also later got Nancy shifting into the monster, the monster thriller slasher with Jonathan. Joyce and Hopper are in kind of a political, it's not the right word.
Conspiracy thriller.
Like, conspiracy thriller, yeah, like sort of story. And then you've got the lab, which is clearly your sci-fi paranormal thing going on, which also includes 11. So, and 11 ends up joining the kids at the end of this episode, because then they all eventually converge towards the end of the season. So why don't we start with the kids, since that's kind of where the story starts. I always forget every time I rewatch the first season that it actually opens with the lab. I always think it opens with the kids playing D&D.
Well, that scene in the elevator scarred me for life, so I don't forget that. In fact, I recently started a new job, and I did not leave the job that I left for the reason I'm about to say, but at the place where I worked before, there were, we worked in this building, and when you pushed for the first floor, you could either, it was confusing, you could very easily accidentally push the basement button, because it didn't say basement, it said 1, and technically, like, the main entrance was on level 2. So I pushed, level 1 one day at the end of, a long day, and I was like, time for the homegoing, and the elevator, first of all, like, the elevator doors in front of me don't open up, the elevator doors behind me open up.
Oh.
That was strike number 1, and then I turn around, and there's this, like, long ass dimly lit hallway with like one flickering light at the end, and I was like, hell no. I'm like pushing the button.
No.
Like I can hear the Stranger Things like lab, the lab alarm in my head, and I'm like, no.
Oh my god.
That was legitimately a moment. So at one point I was in the elevator with another coworker, and somehow the subject of that came up, and I was like, yeah, like you're gonna think I'm dumb, but it was like I actually got like a little bit spooked, and they were like, 'cause Stranger Things?
That's amazing.
So fortunately I did not encounter a Demogorgon. Yeah, I ran.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, understandably. And we can revisit that scene too, like when we talk about the lab. But
yeah,
no, and maybe I just block it because I'm always like, because kids and D&D. So going into the kids arc, I did not play D&D when I watched the show the first time. I do now. I really enjoy D&D, but I remember even at the time being really impressed with how they presented it. It felt like it had been written by people that play D&D, love D&D, and were not interested in making fun of it. They just wanted to portray it from an earnest and sincere place. And the fact that the kids are actually kids, they're not teenagers, they definitely avoid this, like, teens who play D&D are losers, which I hate that trope.
Yeah, it's garbage.
But they don't even run into it here, because they're younger, so they're, like, using their imagination and whatnot. And it just felt very authentic, and there's so much quick characterization that happens. Like, you really get a sense of who those kids are, those four boys are right away. And they're so wonderful. Mm-hmm. And I believe that was one of the first, if not the first thing that they shot. That, if that's true, I'm pretty sure that that's true, that they were able to convey that much just joint chemistry and, like,
yeah,
bonding. Like, I buy it. Like, I believe that those kids have known each other for years, and that they've been playing D&D for years. Mm-hmm. And it was one of the reasons I fell in love with the show so quickly, was because of that scene.
I would say, like, that is up there in terms of, like, an immediate establishment of characterization and an immediate ability to make you empathize with the characters is up there with the introduction of Miles in Into the Spider-Verse. It's just like, it's just instant. And yeah, like it does go a long way to sort of legitimizing playing Dungeons and Dragons, and it goes a long way to like unapologetically portraying Dungeons and Dragons. But you know, of course, there's also that foreshadowing there because, you know, it's a 7. The Demogorgon got him. And also just like the really poignant moment of Will saying to Mike, it was a 7. The Demogorgon got me.
I really want to get the, I feel like a terrible Stranger Things fan because I haven't actually yet gotten the graphic novel that depicts Will's experience through season 1, because I know it's out there. I just haven't gotten it yet. But one of the things I'm curious to find out is how he's able to not get killed/eaten when he's taken. You know, it's funny to not see Noah Schnapp's name in the credits and to remember that he's not in this season very much because he is such a presence in the next 2. And he's actually a real strong presence in this one.
I think, like, his very absence is a presence that has these, like, shockwaves throughout the entire town.
You know, he's there for so much of season 2, and he's so pivotal in both 2 and 3.
Yeah.
That it's like, oh yeah, like, this whole first season, we barely got any on-screen time with him. The most of which is right here at the top. But you care about him, like, right from the jump. And I hadn't thought about this before, but when Will gets home, the fact that he calls out to Jonathan and to Joyce actually says a lot. He expects them both to be there. He thinks to run to them. They are people that he would run to, that they have a bond, that their family is close. Like,
yeah, I think that's a good point. It shows that there is a level of trust there. And it's also just very, like, it's a very endearing, very natural response when you're a kid to just be like, Mom! You know? And it's like, it's so evocative because the Byers' house is also out in the middle of nowhere. Like, seeing him run up that, like, you know, pretty much just the grass path, which is their driveway to the house, he looks so exposed. And I like, too, like, his interactions with the dog, because the dog at first is like, oh, yay, Will is home, and, you know, is all happy to see him and everything, and then seems, like, incredibly frightened, of course, when the Demogorgon shows up, and then the dog, who is a good boy, is waiting outside of the shed for Will. He's just, like, sitting there. Oh, man, it broke my heart.
I actually kind of am really impressed, like, that the dog didn't get hurt by the Demogorgon. Like, the Demogorgon takes Will, but it leaves the dog entirely alone. I'm kind of, like, I'm really impressed, because that's not, and I don't know if they did that just because they wanted the beat a few scenes later where the dog is, like, clearly still upset and Hopper catches that, but I feel like that may not have been the same choice that they might have made in later seasons. So
yeah, for real.
Yeah.
Also, like, last note about the dog, as a dog lover, I just really appreciate that somewhere in the history of entertainment, they let the dog live.
Yeah.
I'm not one much for the dog dying.
Same. And I didn't even think about it. Like, I've never thought about it until this rewatch. I was like, yeah, the dog lives. That's pretty unusual in, like, a great way. One thing about that early sequence of them, that first scene in the basement that I noticed this time that carries through from there, and then also in the sequence later in the office, in the principal's office when the kids are talking to Hopper, is that whether intentional or not, you can see the connection between Lucas and Dustin right away. Mike is the DM, so he's kind of removed from the what are we doing, and then Dustin and Lucas get into the fight of like, no, do this, no, do that, and then they have this like bickering kind of relationship, because then in the office they get into the Hobbit versus the Lord of the Rings argument. Who cares, and they're even fighting and hitting each other like over Mike, who's just staring ahead deadpan like, this happens frequently. I've heard some critiques lobbed at the show. They're like, oh, that comes out of nowhere in season 2. And I'm like, it's right here in episode 1. So, and I like that in that moment when they go in to look at the transmitter, the radio, that Lucas is the one, because you'll see him throughout this season be the one of like, we have to find Will. I don't care about this random girl we found. She's not the priority. We have a mission to find our friend. And it's like, interesting that he's the one that says, when Will sees this, you know, like, it's him that thinks of Will first.
Yeah.
And that the other two are like, yeah, but it's him that thinks of Will initially. I
Yeah.
was like, that's a nice touch. Like, it builds on that believability. Also, Dustin's like, why are we going towards the place
Yeah.
where Will was taken? Is sort of Max says something very similar in season 2. Like, why are you going towards where we heard the noise?
Yeah.
You know.
Max and Dustin's response in that kind of reminds me of, I had a exchange student roommate from Australia, and we were talking about how, you know, in Australia there are just an amazing range of animals who will very happily murder you. And, so, you know, I was like, how do you deal with that? Like, what do you know, like, you've got sharks, you've got snakes, you've got spiders, you know, how do you deal with that? And she was like, if I walk outside and I hear something in the bushes, I walk the other way. It's just simple as. She's like, I've seen you Americans be like, what's that over there? Let's go check it out. Yeah. And, you know, she just kind of thinks to herself, well, she was nice. You know, like, it was nice knowing you.
Well, and that's one thing that I actually really like about the way that Dustin is, like, he doesn't just seem scared. Like, he seems like we're not really prepared for anything. We're just wandering around. You know, he's like, and that was why I joked about it, but I do actually like the fact that he says, without any weapons.
Right.
Like, well, what are we gonna do? We find a monster, we find a Demogorgon, what are we gonna do?
Well, and I think that speaks to kind of like the genre difference, because Mike is coming at this from a very, and I mean this in a positive way, from a very childlike perspective. He's thinking about monsters, and he's thinking about how much he loves Will, and how he would do anything to protect Will. And I believe that. I believe that with my whole heart. But Dustin is actually coming at it from a much more adult point of view. Dustin is coming at it from a point of view that I would have towards the kids, which is, I'm not thinking about monsters. I don't believe in demogorgons. I do believe in kidnapping. I do believe in pedophiles. I do believe in, you know, adults who mean children harm in one way or another. So the three of them going out by themselves with nothing but walkie-talkies, and none of their parents have access to these walkie-talkies. What if they did find Will? What if they did find the person that hurt Will? They could very, very easily be in a great deal more trouble going out trying to help him than staying at home. Which is, of course, why Hopper wants them to stay at home.
Well, and Karen Wheeler also.
Yeah, and those perspectives are absolutely valid. But what they don't take into account is those three boys are at the age where you can't just tell them to stay home. You know, they're really starting to get into their own, like, to the point that it might actually be a little bit safer and more beneficial to let them join the official hunt. Just don't let them go first.
Well, and I think even if they are thinking that it's a literal monster, I think Dustin is still like, but we have no sword, we have no fireball, because we are not actually magically endowed. What's interesting is that influences Lucas, because then it comes up soon here where they, like, gather supplies. Lucas is like, I got a knife, I got camo, I got, like, my wrist rocket, I've got, like, he comes prepared. Shall we talk about Hopper?
Yeah, let's.
So when we see him, he's in bad shape.
He is in very bad shape. One thing that is consistent across all of the arcs is that ability to immediately establish empathy with each of the characters. But even before we get into the station with Hopper, that whole sequence where, you know, he's sleeping on the couch, he, you know, obviously had a rough night or has had a series of rough nights because there's empty beer cans everywhere, the ashtray is full and the TV was left on overnight.
And he's taking the pills with beer.
Yeah, in the morning, yeah. But even, again, like, referencing that scene where he walks outside and starts smoking a cigarette and is just, like, looking out over the lake.
And shivering.
You can tell there's insides there. Like, there's depth of... When I say a character has insides, that just means, like, there's depth of character. There's something going on there. It's not just a one-note performance. You can tell, like... I mean, yes, this is not my first time watching the show, but I feel like, even the first time I watched it, that I had a sense that this is not how he started out. this is something that happened to him rather than how he's always been. And then, of course, you get into the office and see the dynamic between him and his two officers and between him and Flo.
I love that sequence. Like, it was kind of funny, both in season 1 and season 2, when his truck rolls up in front of that police station. I want to stand up and cheer. I don't know why. I think a lot of it's probably because of the way it's shot, but also it's like, yeah, Hopper's here. Like, which I feel that way. Like, when Hopper, like, arrives, like, on a scene, like, it's like, yeah, Hopper's here, like, that's a good thing. But also, the way that sequence is done, that whole sequence is shot in such a way that we're supposed to think he is a badass. And I think it's deliberately done for two reasons. One, I think it's to contrast what happens when he actually gets into his office with Joyce, but also to contrast what we just saw him have to rise out of.
Right.
Like, morning, Flo, morning, boys. Like, how's everything going? And he's shot very, like, high. He's shot kind of high in the frame. His shoulders filled most of the frame at one point. That whole sequence is one shot, which is interesting. Once he walks into the station, that's all one sequence. He's very dominant in that situation. Yeah. Both in the writing and the way that Harbour delivers. Also, just general appreciation for Harbour's performance. Just throughout.
Yep.
But, like, the way he plays that is like, okay, yeah, I'm on that. And then, of course, we get our titular line here. Mornings are for coffee and contemplation.
And it's very, like... And I don't know how active Clint Eastwood was in the 80s, but in that scene... we're getting very Clint Eastwood kind of vibes. Like, I'm above it all. I'm super cool. I'm in charge. But that's undermined very, very significantly by what we've already seen from him, which is that he has this very solitary, depressed, frankly. We see right away that there's an issue of depression there and also of addiction. And that and like you said, he's got to rise up, he's got to psych himself up and get ready. He's got to put on his, like, Hopper suit. And not to say that his demeanor is an act, because I don't think it is. But I think we all, maybe not every day, but I think there are all definitely times when we have to put on our costume.
And I love that then when he walks out of that main office area and he walks into the hallway, the music goes away, the lighting changes, he becomes smaller in the frame, like the frame becomes wider, and it's like it totally shifts. Like, he just sees Joyce and it's like everything shifts. And even though he kind of continues the vibrato a little bit, it's very different. In the scene with Joyce, I noticed this time, blocking wise, he is seated for the entire scene. She is standing for a good portion of it. Eventually she sits down, but it's just like, I liked that change, that shift, and also, like, he starts speaking more slowly throughout it, and it becomes this interesting contrast of, like, Joyce, who is so high-strung. Her whole body language and the whole scene, she's moving almost every moment she's on screen. General appreciation for Winona Ryder's performance.
Yep. We'll get there. Yeah.
We'll get there.
Something that I thought was really interesting in this watch is the power dynamic between the two of them. Because in this situation, Hopper has all the power because literally he is the chief of police. And she's going to him for help to find her missing son. And, within the context of the time period that we're finding ourselves in, she's a woman, she's a single mom, she's a working single mom, 3 strikes. And also, as you said, she's very frenetic, she's very high-strung. She's convinced that someone has taken her boy and he's barely been missing for, like, as far as she knows, like, less than 2 hours. So it would be very, very easy for this power dynamic to work completely against her and for Hopper to say, come back if you don't hear from him by tomorrow. And I am sure that this has happened to many a mother. But what's interesting about the power dynamic in this scene is that it starts off that way, where you have Hopper being like, nah, he probably is just playing hooky. Nah, maybe he went to go see his dad. Whatever. But eventually, he sees her and he hears her. And instead of dismissing her, he actually capitulates to her and takes it seriously.
It occurred to me that I wonder if also part of his isolation and also him dealing with the grief and the trauma of losing his daughter, that he's like, I don't want to get attached to this because it's probably not going to be very long until we find him. But then as he continues to investigate it, it's like there's just enough that's weird about it, dare I say strange, that he starts dedicating himself to it, even though, I mean, he brings up his daughter. Like, I thought that was fascinating. Like, he doesn't even, it's not even like that someone else asks him. He brings up Sarah.
Yeah.
So it's like clearly the fact that this is a missing kid
is weighing on him. Yeah. And I mean, Hopper comes from a long tradition of depictions of men who are cops or were cops that have seen things and have like tried to get away from it all, but then this case comes along and then they have to go back into their badassery and they have to fuck shit up. I'm thinking specifically of Rambo. Rambo is about a Vietnam veteran who, you know, but don't quote me on this. I have not seen the movie since I was a child, but his daughter is kidnapped. And so he goes into full soldier mode, even though he was trying to get past that life. All of these films where you have this guy who is like, I'm not in that life anymore, but then he kind of like has to go back into it for whatever reason. I think that Hopper subverts that a little bit, because so often when we see that character, him getting back into that violence and that lack of empathy is seen as a good thing. Whereas with Hopper, we're really looking at the damage that Hopper has sustained. We're really looking at how he's not in a good place. He's hesitant to sort of accept the call to adventure because he knows how dangerous this is for him emotionally and mentally. I don't think he gives a shit about the physical danger, but I think he is aware of his mental and emotional fragility, subconsciously if not consciously. And so I think that's why he immediately is like volunteering information about Sarah, because he's aware of how much this case is going to push his buttons. And that's before we even get into the whole 11 thing.
Yeah. But I know that you had said you wanted to to address the scene, some of the stuff that gets said in the scene with Joyce.
So the first time that I watched that first episode, my feathers got severely ruffled by the exchange of Joyce telling Hopper that Lonnie used to say that he was queer and called him a nasty word. And Hopper's immediate response is he? I did not like that. I thought Hopper was potentially victim blaming. And I still think that that's a legitimate reading. I don't want to take away from that. But what I noticed in this watching was the first thing that Joyce says is the kids make fun of him. They make fun of his clothes. And Hopper says, what's wrong with his clothes? And Joyce says, I don't know. And she's coming from this sort of like defensive place. And it's totally understandable that she would be coming from a defensive place because she's his mom. She's the one who buys the clothes. So she probably is feeling like Hopper's like, well, why aren't you buying him clothes that won't get him made fun of? And she's like, I don't know what the problem is. You know, Joyce says, is it important? And Hopper says it could be. And so then the queer conversation comes up. I kind of wonder now if there might be room for a more sympathetic reading wherein Hopper's asking these questions because they are important. If Will is getting bullied, or if Will has been abducted by someone because they think he is queer, that is important information. If Will is being bullied or something's going on because they think he's weird or nerd or, you know, his clothes are weird, that's important information too. If he has weird or distinctive clothes and they're looking for him, that's important information. So it took me a while. I mean, it took me 3 seasons to get to that reading of the scene. I still stand by my initial reading of it in that we can't know what he means by, is he? And I think the knee-jerk reaction to that is always going to be like, Hopper's being a jerk. But now, with the benefit of knowing more about Hopper, I'm not saying we misjudged him. I'm just saying, I wonder if there's room for that reading.
Because Hopper also delivers it kind of peculiarly. Like, he delivers it very deadpan. It's very much like, is he? Like, it doesn't convey a whole lot of judgment either way. It's always sounded to me like, okay, don't beat around the bush, just tell me what the situation is. Like, it's, the fact that he doesn't respond to the use of the term that Lonnie uses, that's the part that bothers me.
Yeah.
Is that there's no acknowledgement of, like, his father calls him this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that you were very, very, like, I don't know about this guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. The only other comment I have about Hopper is later when he does go to the buyer's house to bring the bike back and he's starting to investigate, and I like that you do get a sense that while the other cops are lazy and they're not on Hopper's level, they're not total morons.
Right.
And also that Hopper is competent. You see that he is maybe a little bit lazy also, and he's got some stuff going on, but he is treating it, I think you said when we were watching it together, you were like, he's treating this like a cop. He's acting like a cop. He's not just blowing it off. He is taking it seriously, even if he's not taking it as seriously as we will then see him do as we proceed.
Right. His level of escalation is reasonable for his context, and I appreciate that. I don't think that we can ask him to be at the same level of escalation as the kids or Nancy and Jonathan, but I do think that it's reasonable.
Agreed. So, speaking of Joyce and Jonathan.
Yes. I love them so much. I mean, I love all the characters, but damn, I love Joyce and Jonathan so much. Like, the family dynamic that is established in that first scene where Jonathan is making breakfast and Joyce is running around looking for her keys. And even before they notice that Will is missing, like, the level of cooperation and sort of shared responsibility is really, really touching. Jonathan has sort of stepped up into that sort of hero child role, taking on extra shifts at work because they need the money. He's making breakfast for his little brother. He's taking on a lot of child care responsibilities because he's trying to make sure that he's always home when Will is home, keeping track of Will's schedule. Like, he was at the Whalers all day. He's taking on this sort of caretaker role with her for all their sakes, and that it's not from a lack of parenting. Like, you can tell that, like, they are very close. They have a very emotionally healthy relationship. So...
Well, and he'll tell Hopper later. He says she has anxiety problems. And so it's kind of like, I watch that first scene and go, like, he's trying to, like, caretake her as well.
Yeah, he is. Absolutely. In terms of, like, again, like, in terms of trying to help her track down her keys, telling her that he's taking extra shifts to try to take the money. And when she's like, no, we talked about this. You can't do that. And he keeps saying, like, well, you get the impression that, like, yeah, she is coming at that from a place of, you're a kid, I want you to be a kid, like, I gave you the responsibility of looking after Will, but there's the underlying thing of, I don't want you to be taking all of this extra work and worrying about something that you should let me worry about. And him being like, but I want to, because I have to, because we need the money, Just thinking of Jonathan's characterization, not that he doesn't fall down, because we see him fall down in terms of, his behavior in this season, but something that I appreciate about Jonathan's characterization is that he also is a sensitive kid. Very much so. Like, Jonathan is a very sentimental, very nurturing person. He's artistic. The intense way that he is nurturing towards everyone he cares about, honestly, including Nancy even, in this season, is very uncommon. And his, like, active role in being a caretaker for Will and, just really wanting to be there for his family above any of his, other self-interests is, like, it's admirable in that it makes me like his character, but it's also an admirable way to write a teenage boy. I think we have like one template for teenage boy, and you know, you can have any characterization you want as long as it's exactly this. And he kind of breaks that mold a little bit, and I really appreciate that.
Especially in contrast to Steve.
Yeah, and then you have Joyce herself, which is like, she's such a valuable maternal character because she's so imperfect. She embodies so much of what I think a lot of women go through in terms of really trying to take care of their kids and be there for their kids, but they're coming up against all of these obstacles. Like, the fact that Joyce says so many things that so many mothers say, but nobody believes them. Mm-hmm. And that happens throughout this season, but it's already, like, very intensely started in episode 1. Like, she shows up at the police station and she's saying, somebody took my boy. You have to find my boy. And the time when, you know, the call comes literally from the upside down, we know it's Will on the other end of the line. And she says, like, I know it was him. I could hear him breathing. I know his breathing. That sounds bonkers, but she's right. Every single time throughout this entire season, and I would argue throughout the entire show, she says something related to her boys that sounds bonkers. She is absolutely right. And I just think that that's really a beautiful way to validate the maternal experience. Because so often women are right about what's going on, but they're not listened to with dire consequences. And I just, you know, and again, like, Winona Ryder's performance is just so fucking good. But, you know, but she is flawed. She's scatterbrained. She has anxiety. She can't really express herself very well. She doesn't have a lot of money. She's vulnerable.
Like, something that I thought was interesting that was that both Jonathan and Hopper are both telling her to calm down the whole time.
Yeah.
And what I appreciate about Joyce as a character is that she doesn't.
No.
She doesn't, because it happens in season 2 as well. People are like, just calm down, Mrs. Byers. And she's like, no. And that's kind of what Nancy does as well. Yeah, and I love that first scene between she and Jonathan because, I hear her projecting a lot with, like, I can't believe you. Like, she says that over and over.
And you shouldn't be taking all of this work. You should be here for the kids.
Right.
And then, you know, she says later to Jonathan, I haven't been there for you. I'm sorry.
She gets to see how upset he is. Like, the fact that he's like, it's my fault if I'd been here. It's like, so she gets to see, like, her saying, like, that there is an additional level of, like,
right.
I put a lot of blame onto him there. And so they get to kind of cry it out. But also, she's also there going, like, you're upset. Tell me what's wrong. Like, let's, like, tell me. Like, go ahead and let your emotions out. Like,
definitely Joyce has a closer relationship with her kids than either of the Wheeler parents do with theirs.
On the Random Tea Stranger Things podcast, they talked about how in the flashback to in Castle Byers, and how the bit with Poltergeist, they were kind of going back and forth and talking about the different reasoning for why this situation is the way it is, and why she, quote, changes her mind, and they speculate that it's because she didn't think she could afford the tickets.
It's possible.
And so then that's why, but she's like, I'm not gonna change, I'm not gonna tell him that that's what happened. But it's a thing of, like, it's too scary, you can't see it. And so, like, I thought that was a really sweet read of that. And that shot then, when it cuts back to Joyce and Jonathan, like, out there looking for him, that shot from inside Castle Byers, like, looking out, that might be one of my favorite shots of the entire series. I love that shot. It's just, like, with the curtain blowing, it's just, it's such a... You know, I love how warm the flashback is because you're inside. Yeah. The color palette is so much richer and so much more saturated, and then you cut to, like, that really harsh, muted color palette. It's such a nice contrast because it's not that obvious either. It's kind of a subtle change, but it's enough that you can feel
feel it really strongly.
Yeah,
and I love, like, that flashback scene is so valuable because you get such a really, really good view into Joyce's relationship with Will. You've seen now by this point, pretty in-depth Joyce's relationship with Jonathan, but you also see the closeness that's there between her and Will because, she tries so hard to remember Radagast's name and, she's like, Radagast, and then she goes in and she's like, are you gonna have nightmares? And, she's happy to be able to offer this to him. Like, I changed my mind, she says with this little, smile, and that scene raises the stakes really, really high because you see what's missing. You see what can potentially be lost.
Rarely does a scene like that ever really totally land. And I think for whatever reason, it's just the right pacing. It's placed perfectly in the episode. The performances are as good as they are. And it's just enough of something that is meaningful, but also just normal life-ish enough that it really, really hits home. And I love one last note about that first scene. Before the phone call, before she calls Karen Wheeler, the dialogue is back and forth. It's pretty fast. It's very bickery. It's very talking and scolding and no big dealing because again, he's trying to de-escalate, her anxiety. And then it's and then after she hangs up the phone,
it's just silence.
And it's that says so much because now they're both okay, something's
wrong.
So yeah, I love those. I love Joyce and Jonathan, and it's interesting because I would not have lumped those two characters together in one arc because they don't stay connected for they do, but Jonathan will eventually slide over into Nancy's plotline. Speaking of which, so we have Nancy, Barb, and Steve. Those are
the next group.
So the first detail I noticed this time that I thought was really interesting was that Nancy is actually on the phone with Barb when Dustin comes up to offer her the pizza, which is, I'm sure many people have noticed that before, and it's not that big of a deal, but what I like about it is that it's after 8, on a school night, so they're not just friends at school, that is established. So it isn't she gets to school the next day and then Barb just springs, their relationship springs out of existence there. It's they're clearly friends beforehand. I just thought that was kind of a nice little detail.
The inherent necessity as a teenager to be on the phone with your friends for multiple hours because you're essentially hanging out, you're catching up. All of that is done digitally these days, with texting and
social media.
Yeah, and social media. But I kind of had a nostalgia moment of oh my God, I get to have a phone in my bedroom. And I never had an actual phone in my bedroom, but we had multiple, charge phones, cordless phones. And I would be in my room with the cordless phone for ages.
Until the battery ran out.
Yeah. And one of the most common punishments among myself and my friends when we were teenagers was taking away phone time, which was just torture. and also the whole thing of calling someone's house and their parents picking up and being can I talk to Sarah? Or because something that I was just thinking now was did Steve call? How do her parents not know about Steve? But at the same time, I also remember, I don't remember what exactly the stratagems were, but I remember teenagers having elaborate methods of disguising who was calling who and when and why. So it's entirely feasible that Steve could be calling her and her parents could have no idea,
Barb is going to call me at 7:30 tonight or...
Yeah, exactly.
Why don't I call you? Yeah. So when Dustin comes out of the house and says, your sister has a stick up her butt, she used to be cool. And then Lucas, of all people, is the one that says, yeah, it's because she's dating that jerk Steve Harrington. I never thought anything of it, but then this time I wondered, how do they, because by season 2, they all know who he is because they've been dating for a year.
Yeah.
So, they've probably seen Steve a lot by that point, but I kind of just started wondering, how are they even aware of that? And least of all, that he's a jerk.
Yeah.
He's not friends with Jonathan. He hasn't been to the house because when Mike drops the, you just want to hang out with Steve, and it's the who's Steve? They haven't even heard his name yet. But also, when Barb comes up and says, did he call? And Nancy's whole reaction to that is, yeah, and he likes me, but not like that. We just made out a couple times. Does she think that that's all there is?
I would say Nancy's characterization is one of the few that I do think they struggle with. Like, I love Nancy as a character, and when they get her right, it's really great. Because I do like Nancy. I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with their characterization of Nancy. And I love the way that Natalia Dyer plays her. But there are things like that that bother me. She's clearly very attracted to Steve. She clearly is conflicted about how attracted she is to Steve, and that's normal. But I would expect a completely different dynamic. She accuses Steve of just looking to put another notch on his bedpost. She doesn't seem to be looking to put a notch on her bedpost, either with him or with any other guy. That's just not how she approaches relationships. I would expect to see some of that anxiety coming out in a conversation with her best friend, you know? And I'm reading tea leaves here, but I think it's very possible that the Duffer Brothers were concerned that if they wrote her as being, like, into Steve and worried about how he feels about her, that she would appear weak and that she would appear too girly and that they would be doing her character a disservice. I fundamentally disagree with that. Worrying about the feelings of the person you're attracted to is an integral part of the experience of A, being young, and B, being attracted to someone. You know, like, that's part of the whole chaos of meeting someone that you like, you know? And you don't have to take agency away from Nancy in order to make her vulnerable. She can be vulnerable and have agency. In fact, that conversation on her bed, you know, she kind of does the I'm not like other girls thing, but she's coming at it not from a I'm not like other girls place. She's setting a boundary. I am not interested in a sex-only relationship with you. That's not who I am. That's not my life. And he has a moment of vulnerability with her. You mean you're not a slut? And he kind of, like, breaks the tension of the moment with the, like, the teddy bear thing. And then he goes back to studying with her. You know, I think that's why I say, like, he has a moment of vulnerability rather than just being a bro.
That's so interesting because my read of that scene is totally different.
Okay.
Post season 3, Steve is probably my favorite character. However, I hated him in season 1 because for me, that moment always felt incredibly manipulative. To me, it felt like she was saying, I'm not interested in being one of the many. Now, in watching it, you know, twice recently, and Nancy does lean pretty hard on, I'm not like them. So there is a sort of another piece of all this, is that in a lot of the podcasts on Stranger Things that I've listened to, and a lot of criticism and critique of this show, a lot of people come down really hard on her in that moment because they're like, she's slut-shaming, and
she's not, though.
I've never heard it that way, because to me, I heard it always as more of, they're free to do whatever they want, that's not who I am.
Right.
And, like you said, she's not coming at it really from that point of view. She's saying,
she's not trying to.
Yeah, she's like, I don't want to be just one girl more, like, you know, and maybe that's what she means by we just made out a couple times. Like, she's saying, we're not gonna have sex, we're not gonna start a relationship, it's just, we're just making out. Like, that's all it is. So maybe that's my answer right there.
And, you know, hell, maybe she is slut-shaming. Maybe, like, because I do actually like when he says, so you're not a slut, and she says, that's not what I meant. And he says, you're so cute when you lie. Because she is lying. She is saying, I'm not a slut. And, like, in 2020... she would probably say, no, I'm not a slut, and they can do whatever they want. I'm just telling you what I want. Legit, that's what I would say. I like to think I would have said that when I was 17. But, I mean, even if she is slut-shaming in that moment, I think I can forgive her because she's a kid. She doesn't know what she's doing, you know? Like, I'm not going to celebrate for it, but it's like a nuance and a complexity. Like, I'm not going to condemn her for that any more than I'm going to condemn Hopper for pill popping.
But what I find interesting is that, to me, Steve going, so you're not a slut, I don't hear that as a moment of vulnerability at all. To me, he is completely spinning that moment away from his own problem, from what she's saying about, I'm not going to be one of the many. He completely spins the conversation away from that, so they never circle back to it. And it still is how I hear that moment, is very, very manipulative.
It is. And it's like, it's one of those things where I think I actually read that scene differently every time I watch it. When, like, at the very beginning, when she's like, come on, no, we gotta stop making out. And she gets frustrated and said, is this the only reason you came here? And he says, no. I did not believe that for a second until they had that whole conversation. And then actually, like, as I was watching it, they have that whole, like, you're an idiot, Steve Harrington. And he says, you're beautiful. And then she gives him that super, super soft look. And, like, to my eyes, she's, like, ready to start making out again. And then he leans over and picks up the flashcards. That, to me, is what saves the scene. Because everything up to that could have been very, very manipulative. But the fact that he's like, okay, I hear you.
The only thing is that my initial interpretation of that was also like, he's still playing her. He's just like, this is a long game. I just have to play it out longer. This is still me manipulating the situation. I don't actually think I believe that anymore, because having seen
it could be. And, like, I'm not trying to say that he's a choir boy. Like, I hate him being like, if I get an answer wrong, I take off an article of clothing. And if you get an answer wrong, you take off an article of clothing. Like, she had clearly set up the boundary of, I want to study. She said this, like, multiple times.
Yeah.
And then he spun it around into making out. Yep. And that's when she finally really, really put her foot down. She should not have had to do that.
Well, and escalating it from making out. And also her saying, like, my parents are here.
Yeah.
Like,
and I hate that I laugh at the line where he, like, looks around and he goes, I don't see them. Like,
yeah.
Don't like that line, but it's funny.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's been well documented at this point is that, you know, that they weren't expecting that character to become what he became. I do want to, though, spend a, like, half second on Barb and Nancy's friendship.
I really, really enjoy it. I find their friendship very, very true to life. I love that Barb is, like, encouraging her in her relationship with Steve, but at the same time that there's this note of, like, you know, fear of abandonment that's very normal. You know, she's not saying, like, well, if you go off with Tommy H. and Carol, then I'll never talk to you again. It's a playful, like, don't leave me behind as you get super popular, you know. Nancy's response to that is very much like, girl, please, you know. And then when Nancy finds the note from Steve in her locker, like, Barb shifts right back into, like, oh, you were saying? You know, there's so much affection in their friendship. So much props to Shannon Purser for giving us Barb in, like, so little screen time. And yet she has this intense presence to the point that, you know, there are cutesy little books that are supposedly by Barb, like How to Be a Best Friend by Barb or whatever, nice. You know, and she is a fully realized character. But yeah, I love her and I love their friendship. That dynamic is so valuable. And then there's 11. She is so compelling. Millie Bobby Brown's performance is so arresting.
And again, another shout out to Carmen Cuba, because, I mean, that is the perfect casting.
The second you see her face, you are with her. You're like, you know exactly who she is, what she's thinking, what she's feeling, even though you know nothing about her. I mean, the only thing that I'm kind of like, about in this episode with the way she's shot is I love the thing with the bare feet. I love that. But, like, the slow pan up, I'm not sure. I don't like it. It squicked me a little bit. I don't like when women's bodies are shot in fragments. The shot of the feet is great, but the way they pan up felt very male gazy, and she's a child. I mean, male gaze is never appropriate, but it's completely inappropriate with a child. But it wasn't something that I found was a recurring issue that sticks out in my mind. And of course, like, her instant relationship with Benny is really, really compelling. Like, the way that they introduce her powers with the fan is great, because it just shows her just being like, just wanting to do it for convenience, you know, and she's not hurting anybody. She didn't destroy the fan. She just turned it off. And, like, the fact that, like, she's a kid. She wants French fries. She wants burgers and ice cream. And just, like, the really, really small character note that when Benny sees her and she tries to take off, she grabs the basket full of French fries and she's trying to leave. And I'm like, mood, girl.
And that just always spoke to me of, like, that she's smart.
I mean, yeah, there's the I don't know when I'm going to eat again thing, but also the, like, I just kind of love it even on the level of, I really like these and I don't want to leave them behind.
Yeah. Well, the fact that she asks that, or that Benny says, did your parents forget to feed you? It makes me wonder with the way she's wolfing down all that food. Like, it does. It makes me wonder if, like, they weren't really feeding her very much.
I mean, they wanted her to kill cats and whatnot, so, you know, the fact that they might try to starve her and they were putting her in isolation, and she can't fucking talk, so not being able to, you know, have sufficient food is entirely likely. But yeah, I love how feral Eleven is. You know, despite having grown up, being essentially taken care of, kinda, she has a very, like, animal reaction to unfamiliar stimulus. And I love the way Millie Bobby Brown portrays that as very, like, it's so much in the eyes, like the reluctance to talk, the intensely guardedness of her character. And I also love, like, right away that Eleven knows exactly how powerful she is. Her perceptions of herself, we learn later on, are skewed negatively, but she never thinks that she is less powerful than she is. And she knows she already has, like, a good sense of who her enemies are and who her allies are. Like, she doesn't try to hurt Benny. She could very easily have hurt Benny. She could have taken Benny out. She could have even just knocked him down to try to get away. But she didn't. But she had absolutely no hesitation killing those two people when they came for her. And, like, good for her. This is not me making no judgment. I like her complexity. And I love that she's not helpless. I love the film Fifth Element, and you have Lilu, who's a great character, but she has a lot of problems in terms of characterization. She's, you know, a huge example of Born Hot Yesterday. She's completely helpless without Corbin. Eleven doesn't have those problems. Possibly, you know, they got away from that because they're modeling her on Ripley a little bit. Possibly they avoided that because they made her a child. But also, I mean, you know, credit where it's due. Like, they created this, like, really powerful character, but very vulnerable character at the same time. And I love that balance. I love the balance of power and vulnerability, especially in women. Yeah, like, I think she's amazing.
Coming back to it after 3 seasons, while she does grow and evolve as a character, I do like how consistent she is. Her powers will grow a lot, and that she has a lot of inner stuff that she's gonna wrestle with. But I like that this character was very clear from the beginning, and they have stuck to that.
Absolutely.
And I think it's kind of interesting, knowing where the show goes, that her first friend is Benny, who was a friend of Hopper's. So it makes sense that she would end up having, like, this close relationship with Hopper, because...
Because Benny. Again, kind of, like, tapping into that, like, sort of strength plus vulnerability, not strength versus vulnerability. I love that she has this, like, badass scene where she literally kills 2 grown-ass adult men and then ends up in the woods soaked by herself, this, like, pleading and terrified look that she gives the 3 kids, because she does need help. She needs them, and I think, you know, maybe even just on an instinctual level, on an intuitive level, she understands that they're not going to hurt her.
And she takes out the 2 lab guys. It actually frightened me. Like, I forgot how close Brenner got to her. He almost got her. And it almost makes me wonder, like, if Brenner had walked into that back room before she got out, would seeing him have given her enough pause? I don't know.
That moment is a great example of the main character escaping the big bad, and then we find out later just how much danger they were actually in. And I love that in any kind of narrative where you have that brush with the big bad, that you only find out later just how dangerous they really, really are. Like, I definitely didn't know that the lab guys were the bad guys at the very opening sequence with the Demogorgon in the hallway. But, like, as soon as Brenner was like, we will have had this evacuated, we are under protocol, whatever, and they're just like very casually white manning their way to this like,
oh yeah,
you know, and they were like, what about the girl? She can't have gone far. I was like, fuck you in particular.
But I have to say, like, of the lab stuff, I find Brenner to be the most compelling antagonist.
I mean, I think he's their Moriarty.
One, like, random question I had, though, was how did the Demogorgon get in the elevator? How did it get in there?
I pushed the button, Robin. Don't ask questions.
And also, the hallway is awfully empty, although it does provide a nice contrast to them when they go back in with the hazmat suits.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that's an E.T. reference? Because I was just sitting here thinking that must be an E.T. reference.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I'll bet it is. Other miscellaneous notes, comments, things.
My kind of wrap-up thought is just, it really stands up to multiple rewatches. Like, I notice details that I missed every time, and even if I don't, I still enjoy it just as much. And yeah, I'm glad we're doing this because it was a fun time to rewatch this episode.
Same. Yeah, my overall takeaway from this episode was that, yeah, I can still see why it was so compelling for so many people. I can see why it took off so fast. And even now, it's really hard. It was really super difficult to not just keep going, to not just keep watching the season. I mean, even knowing everything that follows, it really was very hard to actually say, no, I don't want to watch chapter 2. There is just something that kind of magic that happened. They came out the gate swinging. The other thing about this show is that it moves. Like, I'd forgotten how much actually has happened by the end of the first episode.
Yeah.
It hits the ground running pretty hard, so, and I appreciate that. So, ultimately, that concludes our discussion of Chapter 1, The Vanishing of Will Byers. It was a good discussion. We realized we have more to say than we realized. Next episode will be a little bit lighter because we won't be starting off with, like, any framing device. We've gotten a lot of our, like, contextual discussion out of the way for the show as a whole, but we will still be bringing that overall, like, spoilery perspective to next episode as well. So thanks for listening, and
we will see you next time.
Over and out. It's so weird, like, he doesn't have the signature hairstyle yet.
Oh yeah,
it shows up it starts to show up next episode, but it's like, yeah, his hair looked very different. I was like, wow, they were
trying to tame it.
They did not. Yes, that's what it is.
They didn't know what they had.